While Far Cry 5 represents a sizable divergence from the tried and true mechanics and structure of its predecessors, it largely fails to gain new ground, rarely feeling new or innovative, and at its worst, feels like a step back. The changes are quickly noticeable. By comparison to 3 and 4, Far Cry 5's map is completely open from the start and much more focused. The collectibles and busy work are still there, but radio towers are gone, and the minimap's been changed into a minimalistic compass at the top of the screen, a subtle change that keeps players from being overwhelmed by loads of things to pick up and activate. The exotic foreign landscapes Far Cry is known for are swapped for the lush coniferous forests of Montana, steeped in rural Americana. This setting, much like Far Cry's previous tropical settings, stands in contrast to the plot and gameplay. The fictional down-home blue-collar community of Hope County, Montana, ravaged by an escalated gang war with an extremist religious cult dubbed Eden's Gate. Where the game splits the most from its mainline predecessors are in the main character and the 4 main antagonists. For the first time since Far Cry 2, the main character is a silent protagonist created by the player and given little to no characterization throughout the game. Our 4 villains, each characterized and written to differing degrees of success, follow Far Cry's trend of interesting, expertly acted villains. Where Far Cry 3's Voss and Far Cry 4's Pagan Min were charismatic and unpredictable, Joseph Seed and his family of homicidal zealots, Jacob, John, and Faith, are sobering, dogmatic, and convicted. Once again, Far Cry's villains steal the show, bringing life and intrigue to nearly each of their appearances. Unfortunately, our silent protagonist and fascinating villains fail to brace Far Cry 5's biggest issue: an incoherent, nonsensical, and uninteresting storyline. A storyline that could and should be better written and just never takes off. It never becomes more than a series of assassinations. Now yes, Far Cry's never been known for well thought out, robust storylines. The series has always focused on gameplay over plot, skirted around big topics without actually delving into them, and fixated on a character going through increasingly insane situations as they delve deeper into a world of violent, psychedelic insanity coupled by a morbid sense of humor. The charm and Joker-like qualities of its villains added to this derangement, and while the stories themselves were often underwritten or disjointed, the villains' relationships with the main characters were always high points. Far Cry 5 completely throws this formula out. The main character is a rookie sheriff's deputy, and that's about all we learn about them. This is the most limited characterization of Far Cry's mainline protagonist the series has ever seen, and it's not even the first time the series has sported a silent protagonist. In Far Cry 2, players picked a character out of a dossier before the start of the game, and even here, with this limited basic information, players learn more about the person they were playing than they learn in Far Cry 5. There's just no reason for the severe lack in characterization. The story itself revolves around the player rescuing their fellow deputies, all of whom also suffer from little to no characterization or personality, and killing Eden's Gate's leaders in the process. There were times while following the main storyline where I wasn't even sure who I was rescuing. See this guy? His name is Deputy Pratt. Players will spend hours of the main storyline with the goal of killing his captor and eventually rescuing him. And for a long time, I had no idea who the hell he was. At one point, I considered I may have accidentally skipped a cutscene or somehow missed an introductory sequence, but nope, he's right there during the intro. Right there. In a dark helicopter, while 2 much more prominent and distinct characters command the player's attention as they introduce them to the world and plot. If you happen to miss him turn back at you for a second, you may have no idea he even exists. The game acts as if there's no way players could have missed or forgotten the guy in the co-pilot seat of the helicopter, let alone not care about him, and that's exactly what happened to me. It's odd and somewhat baffling that a series with some of the most interesting and intriguing villains in gaming, for whom I'm sure are also not cheaply produced, spends so much of its time with one-dimensional characters who serve no purpose and add very little to the game. Additionally, many of Far Cry 5's story missions end up having nothing to do with the story at all. A lot of them are glorified fetch quests made tolerable thanks to Far Cry's bombastic action sequences and open-ended design. These missions don't progress the story at all. Players don't learn or earn anything outside of getting closer to triggering the next cutscene. The game's familiar liberation-style open world is as standard as it gets. Find a place with a bunch of enemies, kill all the enemies, and the surrounding territory goes from hostile to friendly. But oftentimes, the story unabashedly contradicts the ground players have gained. Take Falls End, for example. Falls End is a town in Holland Valley, the area under the control of John Seed. Once players have liberated most of the area and forced a confrontation with Seed, the encounter with him takes place at Falls End, where he's retaken the town and captured just about every character in the town. How did he accomplish this? We don't know, it just happens. This makes taking Falls End initially feel futile, as if players accomplish nothing. And it's not the only time the game does something like this. It's uncreative and unimaginative, and Far Cry deserves much better storytelling. The villains in Far Cry 5 are fascinating, expertly acted and voiced, have conflicts with one another, and are just filled with nuance. Players learn about their histories, and the game even writes in sympathetic qualities for each. It's not perfect characterization, but it is at least interesting and unique. Why these villains have to exist in boring, uninspired stories, I have no idea. And when I say Far Cry deserves better storytelling, I mean just that. Yes, Far Cry is an action series, but that doesn't mean incoherent and broken stories are acceptable. Portal is a game about shooting holes into walls and falling through them, and it's got a great story. The Talos Principle is another incredible puzzle game with a silent protagonist, and its story is amazing. I made a whole video about it. The Modern Warfare series, specifically the first two games, had cool characters and a political military fiction story that touched levels near that of a Tom Clancy novel. These games, in genres that may not facilitate hours of cutscenes and exposition like a Metal Gear Solid, told stories that fit, that were interesting enough to accompany the gameplay and made sense. There's no reason for Far Cry's odd dichotomy of compelling villains and settings set against an ignored plotline. To top things off, both of Far Cry 5's endings are unfulfilling and absurd, each leaving far too much open to interpretation and speculation, and each leaving players feeling as if they did nothing. No one they rescued or liberated matters in the slightest. Far Cry was once a series about innovation. If we push each game's faults to the side for the sake of discussion, each of the first three entries showcase something relatively new. The 2004 original had tough AI that actively communicated and maneuvered against players, and the game's levels were open-ended and filled with multiple paths. Far Cry 2 cranked the series' technological prowess up a notch, with fire that spread, visceral combat where guns jammed, and players had to dig bullets out of their arms when low on health. Far Cry 3 mixed all of this along with fleshed-out stealth and crafting systems and a driving home of the game's falling through the rabbit hole narrative into what I would say is the series' best story and perhaps best game. Far Cry 4 improved on some of the smaller details but didn't really take the series anywhere new. It was and is probably best described as Far Cry 3 but a little bit prettier. Far Cry 5 feels like the first mainline Far Cry to take a step back. Its gameplay does little to set itself apart from other shooters, and what new mechanics were added to the game, we've seen other games utilize much better. The next Far Cry, whenever it releases, needs to be fresh, it needs to be new, it needs to add more than a new setting and cool villains who clash with a meaningless story. And I think it could start with that, an engaging story to match its fantastic villain. It doesn't have to be Shakespearean, and it doesn't need 70-minute cutscenes. All it needs is a story that works in an open world, with characters who are more than archetypes, and where players' actions and decisions matter and have consequences. Most importantly, it just needs a story that makes sense.